Hi, everybody, and a very good morning to you all. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for our Accentuate by K3 Hub webinar, where we'll be considering Wednesday's spring forecast, which has clearly been the subject of many discussions over the last few weeks. For those who haven't virtually met me before, my name's Marie, and I'm a Managing Director at Quantum. And on behalf of our parent company, K3 Capital Group, I lead the K3 Hub, which is a member network for professional advisors developed by us and other companies within the K3 Capital Group. By way of a bit more background to the K3 Hub, we launched in the spring of 2021, and we are proud to have over 3,200 members in our network. K3 Hub offers a range of CPD and training sessions not dissimilar to today's event. Just before we get to our speaker, I just wanted to run through a few pieces of housekeeping, if I may. So, as always, we are recording today's session. It will be placed onto the K3 Hub and Quantum websites next week so that you can look back on any of the points that are covered off today. Q&A function is open, so do feel free to ask questions as we go. So today it will be me that will be putting your questions to our speaker at the end of the session. So if you would be so kind as to give me some context to the question, just so that when we put the questions to Jeremy, he can recall the points that your question relates to, I'd be grateful. And also just to give me a hand, if you could use a Q&A function rather than the chat for your questions, it just helps me stay on track. Based on an in-person session that we ran yesterday for the spring statement, we think we're going to have lots of questions today. So if we don't manage to get around to answering all of the questions, I will ask Jeremy to come back to you via email after the webinar. We are going to be running some short polls today. They are just for fun, but do feel free to get involved. We appreciate your participation, and just to confirm, all responses are anonymous. Final point today, in the K3 Hub webinars, we nearly always share a slide deck. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case today, I'm afraid. However, as I said at the start, we are recording, so you'll be able to look back on the recordings on the K3 Hub and Quantum websites next week if you wanted to recall back to something. Right, moving on to today's webinar then. So I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Jeremy Mindell back to us. Many of you will have heard or seen Jeremy speak before, and therefore he needs a little by way of introduction. Jeremy, as I said, Jeremy did do the in-person, as we're calling it, the trial run for yesterday for today's main event. That was in the Thames Valley, and I know that he's chomping at the bit to get underway. So without further ado, Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marie. So welcome everybody to the spring forecast briefing. And a bit of context to why we have a forecast. We used to have a budget in March, and that was the main budget event with the red book and all the rest of it, you know, the red box. Some years ago, and this has been sort of trialed more than once, it was agreed that it would be better to have one statement, budget statement in the autumn, and the budget in the autumn would bring together tax and spending. So in other words, the idea would be is that in advance of the tax year starting on the 6th of April, government departments would know what they needed to spend. And in terms of the budget, the measures would be announced in October. The legislation would be published in early December. It would be debated in Parliament in January, with royal assent in February, with a view that you've got at least 6 weeks before the beginning of the tax year to see the legislation in effect. And that would stop the need for retrospective legislation, because if you have a spring budget, then the finance bill only becomes the Finance Act in July, and there's an element of retrospection to all of this, because you're already a third of the way through the tax year, and you're suddenly got the legislation not being passed until July. So that sort of hiatus was considered undesirable, and it was always considered right and proper that you should have the tax and spending agreed at the same time in the autumn, with a view to having clear legislation passed before the start of the tax year. The spring statement was then relegated to a requirement to comment on the state of the public finances 6 months or so after the budget. And this is what the Chancellor was supposed to be doing. And what she was desperate to do was to avoid it being a mini budget. The Labour government of 74 to 79 was remembered for having lots of mini budgets and emergency statements and so on. And Rachel Reeves was desperate to show that there was a certain calm hand on the tiller. Whether that is proved by events is another matter. And although she avoided having an emergency statement, some of the items within the statement, namely missing the financial targets that she'd set for the public finances and requiring her to basically scrabble around for savings, particularly from the welfare budget, a further saving from the welfare budget, looked rather like last minute trying to satisfy the Office for Budget Responsibility. And Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies commented that the focus will therefore move to the October budget, and already there's been lots of speculation that she'll be forced to raise taxes again in October, with a knock-on effect on business confidence. So that's the background to the spring forecast briefing. There are only a couple of announcements concerning tax, and I will deal with them. So the first of the Slidos, do you approve or disapprove of the Chancellor's performance to date? Remember, this is anonymous, so please vote now. So can we put that up where we've seen what the vote is? Oh, interesting there. 22% approve and 78% disapprove. So we've got a number of Slidos, but that is perhaps not surprising and certainly in line with polls taken after the spring statement about the Chancellor's performance. In terms of one of the elements that was fairly clear is, instead of honey, I shrunk the kids, it became Keir, I've shrunk the economy. And one of the major announcements I'll talk about a bit later on was that the growth forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility showed a reduction in the growth for this year from 2 to 1%. And that's certainly one of the gloomy backgrounds which affected obviously the public finances. If the economy isn't growing so fast, less tax revenue, more expenditure on items such as welfare. If I look at the bright side of what she announced, with the changes that Rachel Reeves announced, what she is looking to do is to create a surplus. Now, this isn't only what we call a primary surplus. In other words, it's a surplus in terms of the government aims to collect more in taxes and fees than it spends in day-to-day spending. It can still borrow money to invest in long-term investment in plant and machinery and equipment and capital, but its day-to-day spending should be covered by taxes and more. And I suppose on that basis, she may have restored headroom, although we'll come to the Trump tariffs, which could again knock her plans sideways. Just hours after her statement, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, President Trump tariffs, which will have an effect on the economy. One of the elements that was interesting was what I call the emphasis on defense spending, and particularly recharging manufacturing in what might be called the military-industrial complex. I mean, we're back to President Eisenhower on that basis, who termed that phrase. And one of the interesting elements there is the emphasis on rebuilding UK manufacturing based on rearmament. And perhaps no surprise, Sir Keir Starmer went to Barrow-in-Furness, where the new submarines are being built. The announcement of an extra 2.2 billion on defence expenditure in the next financial year is supposed to help with boosting defence spending. Putting it into context, although defence spending as a proportion of GDP is supposed to go up, projected to go up back to 3%, compared to others, to historic times in the 1980s, for example, it's still well below what it was during the Cold War. And we will wait to see whether actually defence spending will need to go up further if, for example, the United States decides that defending Europe is no longer its priority. What were the other measures that people looked at? Well, planning and housing. And this is one of the areas where the government believes, and the OBR has taken that on board, that changing reforms to planning will encourage housing and will encourage growth. I'm personally a little bit skeptical that they will achieve their plans, because building does not just require planning permissions, it also requires the availability of skilled staff and materials. I mean, there are occasions that with HS2 that actually, the country ran out almost of concrete and supplies, building supplies, because so much was being taken by the mega projects. So in terms of infrastructure, you need to have all your ducks in a row. You need the planning, you need the materials, you need the skilled labor. And that could prove quite challenging. When we look at the mega projects, the infrastructure projects like the new runway at Terminal Heathrow, and new rail projects and new airport projects and so on, again, that issue is not just planning permissions, which are, of course, extremely important, but also the availability of the people and materials to actually do the job. The other question, which I think will come up politically, is one of the issues is whose statement was it? In terms of, a statement, if you said, well, the highlights of the statement was defence spending was up, welfare was cut, cuts to unprotected departments. So the only protected departments were health and defence, foreign aid cut, and more resources to HMRC, with the exception of the last point. You might think to yourself, is this a Labour statement? And certainly I think that one should not underestimate, despite the government's very large majority, that this is an area that could cause them problems in the future. And then the point that came up was the perhaps shocking reduction in the growth for this year. Remember, this was forecast in October was 2% growth. It's now dropped to 1%. And although it's supposed to marginally go up in future years, that is quite a turnaround and quite a blow on that basis. And that will have, in my view, an effect in terms of what will go on. This is the source, Spectator, and also the Budget Responsibility. These are the figures that came from the OBR. So the second Slido is poll. Do you think that the cut in growth forecast from 2% to 1% is the government's fault, due to international factors, or neither? Okay, let's see the votes on this, scores on the board. Oh, right. And Interestingly enough, again, a significant majority believe it's the government's fault. Some people, a significant minority, think it's the international factors, and very few people are casting blame elsewhere. So thank you very much. Let's move on from that to in a nutshell, it wasn't a particularly heartwarming statement. You know, growth halved, productivity is stagnant, inflation is up, unemployment is rising, and the shocking thing was that the OBR believes that the unemployment rate will rise for the next 3 years above that, and taxes at their highest level as a percentage of GDP in about 80 years, which is not a great lineup on that basis. One of the few tax measures that was announced was more resources for HMRC. HMRC was cut quite a lot in the early 2000s, the Gershon Review, and it was not a protected department during austerity 2010 onwards. So HMRC suffered cuts under the chancellorship of Gordon Brown, and then suffered more cuts in the coalition years, and then has been sort of rebuilt in numbers because the government's worked out that for every pound it puts into HMRC, it gets about £10 back. So it seems a bit of a no-brainer to put more money in. In terms of staff, upgraded systems like their Connect system, which means that there will be more inspections, and probably the Chancellor mentioned more prosecutions pour encourager les autres, to try and ensure voluntary compliance, and new powers in terms of criminal prosecutions for HMRC for promoters of certain types of tax evasion schemes. So we're looking at more powers for HMRC, and I think that HMRC is always looking to expand its remit in terms of both its powers and its inspections on a selective basis. And gone are the days when accountants didn't hear very much from HMRC in terms of inspections. You will expect more of them more often and more intrusively over the next few years as the government looks to fill its coffers. In terms of inflation, again, this is from the OBR, published by a Spectator, but published by the OBR. On this basis, you're looking at 2.6% inflation was what was promised in October, becoming 3.1%, and then falling afterwards. Although how, given the position that with the Trump tariffs and so on, that they can ensure this is difficult to quantify. The point would be is what we do know is that despite February's surprise drop in inflation, consumer prices index is supposed to be well above the Bank of England's target, which means that interest rate cuts will become quite difficult. The element here that is also a difficulty is that with employment, you've got really the end of the jobs miracle. So even during the period, first of all, unemployment did not go up as much as was anticipated. And secondly, employment went up, and indeed jobs boomed during the 2010 to 2020 period. We really are at the end of the jobs miracle. And I think that there are a number of reasons for that. But what has been focused on is the triple, if you like, impact on employers of the national insurance rises, the minimum or national living wage rise of 6.7%, and the employment bill. And that triple effect has already caused a significant number of companies to say we're either not taking on staff, or actually we're going to cut staff, or in certain cases we're just going to offshore operations on that basis. And I think that, you know, this is where you've got a situation where the sort of employment rate of 61% we had just before the pandemic, which then recovered after the pandemic. What you've seen recently is a major slide in the employment rate, and that is not recovering anytime soon. So the next Slido was, do you approve or disapprove of the national insurance rises, the employment rights bill, or the increases to the national living wage? Do you approve or disapprove of them? If you agree. Okay. So let's scores on the board. National insurance rise, perhaps unsurprisingly, 90% disapprove. The employment rights bill, still a majority, but nearly 60% disapprove of it to 40% who approve. And the increases to national living wage, perhaps unsurprisingly, that's the one people approve of the most. And I do feel with that, that actually, you know, if you just had the national living wage rise on its own, I think most people would have thought that that was quite reasonable. But putting the three together certainly had an effect already before they come in on employment, and I think will have a further effect afterwards. Okay, let's move on. In terms of what happened last July, the first half of 2024, we were the fastest growing economy in the G7, and the second half growth stalled. So I can't remember what happened in July. But the other element with that was that undoubtedly the headroom for error. So the headroom is the buffer which the Chancellor has if her forecasts aren't accurate on the public finances. So, you know, generally the average has been around about 25 billion. Sometimes it's been a lot more. So the Osborne coalition period had a lot of fiscal headroom at various points, mainly because the OBR underestimated the growth and of the economy in the coalition years. So George Osborne had more money to play around with. Post the coalition, the amounts of headroom tended to get less, although they were relatively stable under the Hammond years. Under Sunak, the amount was again relatively stable. Under Jeremy Hunt, the amount of fiscal headroom, particularly when you were dealing with the pandemic, was much less. But if you look at it when it comes to January 2025, and that was Capital Economics forecast before recent events, actually the headroom got a lot less and became negative, which is why the government was scrabbling around for measures to balance the books ahead of the spring forecast. One of the biggest uses, despite the welfare changes, sickness benefits still be increasing, and the Chancellor may have to come for more. And the effect of the changes means that actually it is, although the Chancellor trumpeted 3 cuts in interest rates, actually on that basis, based on the OBR forecasting and the latest market expectation, those future interest rate cuts will be less and will take longer based on the current fiscal position. The real difficulty, I think, is productivity. And in terms of productivity, this isn't something new. You can't just look at this government. You can't just look at the previous government. This goes back to when the financial crash, which permanently reduced the size of Britain's most productive sector, which is financial services. And since then, we have, as a country, been struggling to improve our productivity. And that's a big challenge, in my view, because without greater productivity, we cannot justify paying ourselves more or indeed putting in greater public services. And it's fair to say this is not something that is new. And this is an area which governments have been trying to deal with. Labour, coalition, Conservative, and now again Labour. And it is really a difficult problem. Whether AI and new technology will help us remains to be seen. And in terms of the public sector, we've seen increased numbers of the public sector, particularly since the pandemic. The headcount has gone up, but productivity has not. And in areas like the health service, where money has been pumped in, productivity has completely collapsed. This is a major issue for whoever is in power. This is where you start realizing that economics is an interesting game where forecasting is a mug's game. Where you've got a straight line from 2027 onwards, it basically means that nobody's got a clue. The effect of the disruptions of international trade and other elements, like, for example, employers passing the very significant increased costs of employers' national insurance from next month onto their customers, will result in a spurt in inflation. If you're facing potentially hundreds of millions of pounds worth of extra employer NIC, which some large organisations are, where do you think they're going to find the money? It's going to be increasing prices, as has been warned by the supermarkets, the hospitality sector. Anyone who's seen, for example, employs a lot of lowly paid staff, relatively lowly paid staff, just the reduction of the threshold from 9,100 to £5,000 increases your bill per person by £615 per person. If you think about the hospitality, the care sector, the retail sector, they all employ quite a lot of part-time and relatively lowly paid staff. You are going to see that in prices. And in taxes, of course, you're going to see lots in terms of taxes, the tax burden under Labour as a proportion of GDP due to rise to around 38%, a figure not seen since the 1940s. And the question in Survation did a poll of cabinet ministers, and this is before the spring statement, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Rachel Reeves, even amongst Labour party members, is the most unpopular person. That's perhaps not surprising, given that she's in charge of the purse strings, and perhaps the rating of Ed Miliband, I might venture to suggest, the favourable rating of Labour Party members may not be shared so much by the wider public, but it is quite interesting to see the way that she doesn't have a great deal of political headroom to make further unpopular measures. The polling company also said that Ms. Reeves was struggling with public perception. While some people described her as good and determined, many words used to describe the Chancellor were pejoratives, including terms such as horrible, useless, and dishonest. Now, if I was Chancellor, being horrible is probably part of the job, because at some point I've got to say you can't have any more money. So being a Chancellor, it goes with being a bit horrible at times, but possibly useless and dishonest I wouldn't be so happy about. The polling has been published amid a row over the Chancellor's decision to accept free tickets to a Sabrina Carpenter concert. I was a bit confused because I thought of the Carpenters being a 1970s, 80s band, but evidently there's a new Carpenter around. I'll need to get onto my social media to find out about this new pop star. The survey showed Britain remained gripped in a doom loop, with 4 in 10 Britons believing the economy was already in recession, which it is not at the moment. But perception, when you discuss whether to spend money, grow, invest, they're all important. And 61% pessimistic about what Ms. Reeves will reveal on. The other element that is interesting about the Survation polling was the polling signals a sharp turnaround in attitude since the election. Labour was trusted to manage the economy ahead of last year's vote, according to polling at the time. The share of Britons who expect Labour to improve their lives has fallen from 54% before the election to 29% today. More in Common said only 13% of Britons but think that Labour's economic policies are in line with what they promised while in opposition, while Britons overwhelmingly agree that Labour's policies have shifted since the election. And this is important in terms of the political headroom to make further changes. Only a third believe that this change is due to changing global circumstances or the Conservatives misrepresenting the state of public finances. And that change in circumstances is reflected in the global circumstances in the third in the Slido poll that we just had. Most believe that this shift was planned and is the government's doing. So the next Slido poll is, do you think that the UK is going in the right direction? Yes, no, or unsure. Okay, let's get the results. Oh gosh. Well, slightly more optimistic than yesterday's run in Thames Valley, where nobody thought that the UK was going in the right direction, but still astonishing 72% said no and 14% said unsure on that basis. I'd have to say, if the movers and shakers, which you are, the people who are thinking about it, don't believe that the UK is going in the right direction, this is not going to be good news for the economy, because economies are built on confidence as much as anything else. Thank you very much. So moving on from that, are we becoming like France, which in some ways might be a good thing? Cappuccinos and coffees and croissants in the morning. Despite the French working less hours, they seem to be more productive than us. They have roughly the same standard of living, although I would point out that their unemployment rate is about double the UK's. And they are not without challenges, as President Macron has been forced to look at. But there are elements where we do look a little bit more like France. We have new employment rights, higher national insurance, and higher minimum wages. And the element that I think would be positive would be, well, if it creates a more, an employment force that employers value more, where there's more spending on training, where people spend less time at work, but they're more productive at work, then that may be good. Whether we are heading in the right direction, generally speaking, you have voted that we're not. As I say, the sunny view would be that we would end up a bit more like France, because with a more productive economy and a happier workforce. Whether that is likely or not remains to be seen. But that's certainly, we are converging more with our European neighbours than we are with our competitors across the Atlantic. So the next question I have is, do you believe that the OBR is fit for purpose? Now let's take that poll. Let's get the answer to that. Yes, no, about the same, and unsure 53%. Great. So, thank you. One of the things is the OBR does have a lot of power, and has been given more by this government. Interesting. Well, employment regulation policies that affect the flexibility of businesses and labour markets, or the quantity and quality of work, will likely have material and probably net negative economic impacts on employment prices and productivity, which is a shock of the employment bill currently going through Parliament. But the OBR also has an effect because it could be seen as reducing government initiatives. So this was what one individual said, who was in the previous government as a chief advisor. In the run-up to the autumn statement of 2023, the Chancellor focused on scoring as many different growth policies as possible. And the result was an impressive 110 growth measures that the Treasury estimated would boost business investment by 20 billion a year. The most significant were cuts to national insurance, making full expensing permanent. This was under the previous government, and some welfare reform measures. The OBR acknowledged that these did indeed boost growth, yet they didn't score any of the others, a fact that was pointedly made in meetings between the Chancellor and the OBR, only for them to sit impassive and silent on the issue. To rub salt in the wounds, they went on not only to ascribe no positive benefit to most of the measures, but to not even mention more than 100 of them in their economic and fiscal outlook. All that work and political time and effort for nothing. Much weight is rightly given by the OBR to experts. At one point, the Treasury even took the Chief Medical Officer to a meeting with the OBR to impress upon them the significant impact increased funding for musculoskeletal disorders and obesity programs would have on the labour market. This didn't work. They wouldn't score anything positive, so we didn't provide any of these proposals with funding. So you do wonder about that, on that basis. And I think that what was interesting as a final point was the aim was to spend on capital projects that would reduce day-to-day spending in years to come. A lot of work and personal political capital had gone into this for Hughes, who is the head of the OBR, to sit across the table and tell the Chancellor that they had a look and were not convinced. The advisor said, I couldn't get out of the room fast enough. And I do wonder, current government will have the same problems with the OBR, that if they come up with initiatives, the OBR still won't allow them a bit more headroom in their forecasts. Let's move to international, and one cannot ignore the effect of Donald Trump, move fast and break things. And, the tariff wars, we'll talk about what happened on Wednesday a little bit more, but one of the final Slidos, do you think tariff wars will affect the economy? Yes, no, or unsure? A few seconds on that. Okay, let's see the results. Yes. Only one person said no. Interesting. And obviously, as a background, this is... I don't know what's happened here. Sorry, honey, I've shrunk the slides. Here we are. That has been a real issue. On the stump when he was being elected, we're looking at 10 to 20% tariffs across the board, 60% on China, cutting green spending, keeping 2017 tax cuts that he put in on his first administration due to expire, make them permanent. What has he announced so far? Well, 25% tariff on Mexico, 25% on Canada, and 10% extra tariff on China. On Wednesday, what you saw was a 25% tariff on cars with no exceptions, so far on that basis. Other proposals he's got are 25% tariff on steel, and then next week, April the 2nd, is tariff day, I believe, potentially retaliation on countries imposing duties and VAT. Duties, I sort of understand. VAT is mad. Sorry, perhaps I shouldn't say that, but that is a willful misunderstanding of VAT, shall we say, because VAT is imposed on products irrespective of whether they're produced domestically or they're imported. If I import a product, I pay 20% VAT. If I buy it in the shop in the UK, I pay 20% VAT. On that basis, it is not discriminatory. But let's see what happens. And there's a lot of talk about the UK giving up its digital services taxes, bringing in a handy £700 million on social media companies in exchange for leaving us out of some of the tariff wars. A quick reminder on that basis, they're different powers. Congress has lawmaking powers, potential permanent changes, difficult if controls in different parties. With executive orders on that basis, there are limited temporary powers, and they are temporary only. And it may be that actually what we're looking at here is escalating in order to de-escalate, so ratcheting up the tariffs with a view to getting an agreement. And certainly Scott Bessent, who is the Treasury Secretary, has looked at on that basis, and he's considered as one of the, shall we say, more considered members of the Trump team. And I think that don't have much time, but I just thought I would put on there, President Trump speaks like a New York real estate developer. He's one of his teams, and this is open gambit. It is a maximalist negotiating position. The purpose of the tariff plans is not just to raise revenues or rebalance trade, but to extract negotiating concessions on that basis. And he said tariffs are a useful tool for achieving foreign policy objectives, whether it's getting allies to spend more on their own defense, opening foreign markets to US investment, securing cooperation on ending illegal immigration, and interdicting fentanyl trafficking or deterring military aggression. In terms of the squeeze, Trump is imposing tariffs, phasing them in terms of China, for example, over a 2-year period. And what he said there is, you say to President Xi, 60% might be 2.5% a month for 10 months. So tell us when you've had enough. And I think that this is only the opening gambit in terms of what Trump may do. In terms of action points to be considered, what I would say in terms of action points is that planning is necessary. In other words, you need to understand your businesses, how far they will be affected by global developments like tariffs, and indeed domestic developments like the increasing cost of employment. Understanding your businesses and making plans rather than precipitate action on developments which may change very quickly are important. Understanding where your strengths are and where your vulnerabilities are, in my view, is much more important than saying, oh, we're going to shut this, or we're going to open this, or we're going to do something on a sort of a rushed basis. Plans do change. Even the business property relief, IHT plan, which reduces the IHT breaks for potentially small and medium-sized businesses, they may change over the next couple of years. So important to understand how they might affect you, but probably not taking any action until you've considered the full effect of the plans and how they might work and how they may be very temporary ones. So I would say planning is important. Precipitate action, I don't think, is something that I would do in a very a very quickly changing world. And I would say my lodestar on this is planning and keeping calm and considered. Thank you very much indeed. I'll now hand back to Marie on that basis. I'll stop sharing. And Marie, there may be questions or other elements.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that, Jeremy, for that fascinating canter through the highlights and the lowlights. We do have some questions, so I will get underway with those. We've had a couple come in ahead of the webinar, so I will start with those first. So I think I'm going to go from easy to hard, I think, put you through your paces. So first question, and I'm just going to read these as they've come in. So when to the nearest year will the government deliver true growth?
Oh, true growth. So I suppose you could argue 1% is growth. It's not going to, it's probably not enough to help with some of our economic problems. I'm not sure. If the infrastructure really works, then you could see significant growth, I think, by 2027. But it's interesting, you know, Heathrow, the runway isn't going to deliver till 2040. And I'm not saying politicians are often criticized for short-term thinking. So going ahead with the Heathrow runway is an element which may produce growth in, you know, the next decade and a half. But in terms of if the infrastructure works, then you might see some true growth in about 2027.
Lovely. Okay, what else have we got here? So another one that's come in up front. So do we foresee a raid on private pension scheme funds anytime soon? If so, will that look to existing funded amounts or perhaps a cap on future contributions?
The cynical view is that one of the reasons why the government has not raided pensions is because the yawning gap between public sector provision and private sector provision would become even greater. And I think there would be a huge backlash on that basis. And that's the reason why, for example, originally Labour were going to put back the lifetime limit, the lifetime allowance on pensions, and they decided, no, we're not going to do so because that'll affect doctors and consultants who we need in the NHS. So my view is this is one of the ones that looks easy, but the more you unwrap it, the more difficult it becomes. And unless the government is in a real pickle, I don't think they're going to do that.
Thank you. Right, so into the questions which are now coming in thick and fast. So I'm going to go through these in running order. So Andrew has asked, do you feel, as others do, that interest rates should not be as significantly above the level of inflation as they are?
If you set the Bank of England to, you know, an inflation target, and the bank's main tool is interest rates, what else are they going to use to bring it down? And they're marked on that basis. So if interest rates fall, that will only happen if the Bank of England is confident that inflation will fall within target, because that's what it's mandated to do. If you want interest rates to fall further, you've got to change the institutional architecture of the independence of the Bank of England. And I'm not sure the government's going to do that.
Lovely. Richard has asked, if you have a stocks and shares investment portfolio, would you put cash in the current environment?
I'm not an IFA, so I can't answer that question.
Simple.
I mean, clearly, one of the points that you have to look at is, you know, what is your success in riding the market? Are you a good stock picker? There are always advantages. If you would put money into defense stocks in February 2022, you'd be making a fortune. Look at some of them, but not all defense stocks, some of them. I'm not an IFA. I cannot give advice on that basis. The only thing I can say to you is you know, you've got to look at how long is your investment horizon? When will you want the money?
Great, thank you. Next question. Are there any planned changes to the rules on ISAs, specifically on the lifetime ISA?
Nothing so far. Lots of rumours about changes to cash ISAs and whether they're going to put a lifetime limit on ISAs and so on. We'll have to wait to the autumn. Again, this is something that they may fiddle with at their peril. It's possible you will see issues in terms of cash ISAs being, you know, not restricted, more trying to push people into stocks and shares. But you would have thought the government would want to encourage investment rather than discourage it, and ISAs are one of the ways. So I don't know of the changes, and I'm not sure they're going to produce a lot of cash immediately for them.
Lovely, thank you. How long do you think it will be before we get the next Chancellor, or is the job too much of a poisoned chalice?
Given the way that the Prime Minister's worked so far, and looking at precedents, Chancellors and Prime Ministers normally fall out with each other at some point. It was an interesting article I saw recently that said the only one that was really harmonious was Cameron and Osborne got on really well. My view is that Rachel Reeves has taken a lot of stick. Some of it is economically based, some of it is her personal actions, you know, the CV and all of that. And at some point, she has no political popularity even within her own members. So if Keir Starmer wanted to dispense with her, at the moment she acts as a sort of human shield for Keir Starmer, whilst he is dealing with foreign matters and Trump and all the rest of it. But there may well come a time, a bit like with Norman Lamont, where she may be offered a job, a sideways move, which she may or may not accept.
Lovely, thank you. Right, a couple of questions from me here then in that case, just to round us off. So I'm going to ask you to step into the shoes of the Chancellor for a second. So we've obviously seen in one of the earlier polls, there was a landslide disapproval from today's delegates, and obviously you saw that again yesterday in the Thames Valley. If you were the Chancellor, how would you turn this boat around?
I think I'd stop talking down the economy, stop talking about dreadful inheritance, the worst since the Second World War, which was nonsense. I mean, you know, and I would stop making obvious comments that are clearly factually incorrect. Stop playing the political thing so much and try and be a more masterful Chancellor. I was struck by the number of times she talked about, we do this and the opposition do that. Yeah, of course, she's a politician and, you know, she has to make her point. But I think there's a point at which she has to slightly rise above it and become a bit more statesmanlike. And I didn't see that in the spring statement. So I would say rise above it to a certain extent. Don't talk down the economy and be a bit more nimble about what you do. Try and get some good news in terms of investments and considered opinions. Don't chase the headlines, but considered strategies that people may not agree with, but they would in the end respect. And I think that, you know, she's run out of road quite fast. And one of the problems I think I have is people say, oh, but she's got, you know, 4.5 years and counting until the next election. But I would say that sometimes governments lose credibility at the beginning. The John Major government, after their 1992 election success with the ERM fiasco, lost credibility really quickly. And even though they had a pretty good run after that in terms of economic competence, the public never gave them credit because they always said, well, everything good happens despite them and everything bad happens because of them. And Rachel Reeves is in danger of being in that position. So I would say a bit of masterfulness, a bit of rising above it all, not chasing the headlines, and being shown to have a consistent strategy would help her.
Very good. Thank you. I'm conscious of the time here, so we're going to do a couple more quick fire questions before we wrap up. So John has asked, how likely do you sorry, I'll start that again. How likely do you believe we are to see tax rises in the next budget?
Very likely.
Very good. John again has asked another question here. Give us some quick wins the Chancellor could go for.
Quick wins would be, in my view, to try and take money from welfare and spend it on really supporting people back into work, trying that positive message. I mean, they announced $1 billion, but if she could show some really good seed, public investment, seeding private investment that brings jobs in, I think that could be a good quick win. The other one, which I would do, but again, I can imagine a lot of other people wouldn't, would be to pause the employment bill for 2 years. I would do that. I'm not sure she would, but given what the OBR has said about it, I would pause it for 2 years.
Lovely, thank you very much. Right, we do have a few questions left over, but I think we've broadly run out of time. So, thank you very much, Jeremy, for speaking today. As always, very insightful, and I realise now that we are approaching our 10-year anniversary of working together, so we shall mark that the next time we speak, I'm sure. All that's left from me then in that case is to thank all of our delegates for joining us today. Thank you for taking time out of your Friday mornings to join us. We do have a CPD session coming up in a couple of weeks' time. That is on VAT, always very, very popular. Do look out in your inboxes for invitations to that. You can also find all of the details on the K3 Hub website and also the Quantum website. That's about it for us from the K3 Hub today. Thank you very much to everybody for joining and have a great weekend.